It's so nice to be back. This is family to me. If you were here this morning, we did talk about the spirit of generosity. That there's no such thing as a generous, cranky person. And if you're cranky, start giving and you'll be happy. There is actually a chemical that goes off when we give. Physically, we are wired by God that science says that when we give, we release a chemical in our body that makes us happy. Even, there was some research done by a university in America, and I do some work with the QUT Center of Research for Philanthropy and Not-for-Profit Studies. And they said this, that the more generous you are, or altruistic, the technical word, is you become more attractive. You actually look better. They actually say you'll become more sexually attractive. And so don't worry about Botox. Just start handing out some money. Start buying people some coffee. And straight away you become, all the single people here like, yes, let's go out for coffee, like my shout. But from this morning to this evening, I want to continue one thought. And that is the stream that the kingdom of heaven is constantly generous. That God himself is the greatest giver. And that to be children of God, we can take that upon ourselves and our identity, our true identity, and be givers just like Dad. He owns the restaurant. He owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. And therefore, we have access to that source according to his riches and glory. And that we then get to be conduits to that, to the whole world around us. So we're going to continue our thought because Summit was about adding. It was about addition. It was about adding capacity to our heart. And as I touched on this morning, is that in that addition, there is a multiplication that comes in us and through us. In Genesis, it's stated 4 times God's mandate to humanity is to be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. We are given a mandate by God that our divine design is to bear fruit, to take that, multiply it, and then fill the earth. If we were to take the fruit in your life right now and multiply it and fill the earth, would it bring more heaven or would it bring something else? Let that be our decision-making filter. So ready to go on the journey this evening with me? Okay, let's go. In Luke 22:42, Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane, the place of the press. He's sweating drops of blood. The twisted olive trees are around him. He is lonely. He is facing what we would consider the greatest test and trial for the human soul. And he prays this prayer. And when we read it in hindsight. But in that moment, he prays this prayer. He says, God, not my will, but your will be done. It's a powerful prayer. It's easy to say, hard to mean. Right? Like, when we think God's will's for us, we're like, yes, his will for my life because it's easy. But what about when he says, can you trust me enough to take you through the process where I know you're fruitful. I know there is a blessing on your life, but are you willing to let me break that blessing for the multiplication for the multitude? Jesus was blessed, but he was about to get broken in order to multiply that life for all of the world for eternity. But he had a choice. Even Jesus had the choice. I can stay blessed. It's not about heaven and hell. I can stay blessed. Or if I choose God's will over my life to be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth, I will choose to be broken for the multiplication of the multitude. C.S. Lewis said it this way. There's only two kinds of people in the world. The people who say to God, your will be done, and the people to whom God says, your will be done. Almost to say to us, every day we have this choice where we go unto God and we say, your will be done. Or we can live somewhere else and God says, well, your will be done. C.S. Lewis continues, in Christianity, God is not a static thing, but a dynamic, pulsating activity, a life, a kind of drama, almost, if you will not think me irreverent, a kind of dance. So God has a dance floor. And he wants you to rock the party with him. Join in the ecosystem of God, the dance of God. Because when we say to God, your will be done, we enter his dance floor. When God says to us, your will be done, what we are really saying is, God, I want my own dance floor. The problem is we think we're great dancers by ourselves. It's the same kind of confidence, if you were ever a fan of Seinfeld, that Elaine Bennis has when she takes the dance floor by herself. All you have to do is YouTube Elaine Bennis Seinfeld dancing. And you will find what you will look like spiritually if you dance by yourself. See, we have this dance. God introduces us to this dance. And he says, all you have to do is say, not my will, but your will be done. And we have access to the dance floor of God. Or he can say to us, your will be done, and we are over here dancing on our own. So here's a foundational thought for this evening. We have to be moving from our ecosystem to God's ecosystem. See, the ecosystem of God says this. He has given us time, he's given us talent, and he's given us treasure. And everything that he's given us, we turn unto him and we say, God, you've given us so much. What can I do to serve the people around me? That's God's ecosystem, this dance of unity, this dance of love, grace, peace, generosity. But then there's also the other dance floor for ourselves. And the ecosystem in us says this: God, you've given me so much time, talent, and treasure. I'm going to use it and I'm going to lord it over people so they serve me. It sometimes looks the same, but the motive is very different. I want to be on God's dance floor with all of you. I don't want to be Elaine Bennis over here dancing by myself. But we have a daily choice. God's will, our will. God's ecosystem, our ecosystem. And it's in that space we find ourselves wondering, what do we do with everything that God has given us? In Ezekiel 28:12-19, I told you I was going to talk about the fall of Lucifer, so here we go. You were the seal of perfection, speaking of Lucifer, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. You were in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone was your covering. The workmanship of your timbrels and pipes was prepared for you on the day you were created. You were the anointed cherub who covers. I established you. You were on the holy mountain of God. You walked back and forth in the midst of fiery stones. You were perfect in your ways from the day you were created. Now watch this. Till iniquity was found in you. Not on you, in you. And so when they're describing, Ezekiel's got this vision of what Lucifer was like. And to be fair, I'm not some weird, super spirit that's trying to find a devil everywhere. But what I am trying to describe to us as humanity is why God would posture his kingdom in a way that would completely oppose the kingdom of darkness. Because when God created him, he was perfect in beauty. Better looking than the Bachelor. Far better looking. And he says, you were perfect in beauty. And he says, and every precious stone was your covering. You were the cherub who covers. Notice there's only one. He would walk up and down the throne room of God. It talks about later on, it says this: till iniquity was found in you by the abundance of your trading. So he would walk up and down the throne room of God. He was a worship band all in himself. The timbrels, the pipes, was in his workmanship. And what theologians and historians have said, like Jonathan Edwards from the 18th century, said this, that the covering cherub was in charge of taking the glory from the throne room of heaven and passing it through himself and letting it minister to all of heaven and earth. The glory of the throne room would pass through him and he would steward it to all of creation until iniquity was found in you. And the abundance of your trading. What did he trade? God's dance floor for his own. I can be a part of God's ecosystem, or I can trade it for my ecosystem. And it says this, watch this. You became filled with violence within, and you sinned. Therefore, I cast you as a profane thing out of the mountain of God, and I destroyed you, O covering cherub, from the midst of the fiery stones. Your heart was lifted up because of your beauty. You corrupted your wisdom for the sake of your splendor. Sounds like an ecosystem deal. Remember I said this morning, your fruit can look really pretty and Instagram friendly. He was Instagram pretty. But because he saw that, he identified with something that pushed him to a space of ego rather than eco. And rather than saying, what a privilege to be in the presence of God, to steward his glory, he said, where's mine at? I don't want to be, I want everyone to look at me. It's like, look at me, look at me, look at me. I'm perfect in beauty. But you can be in the throne room of heaven, experiencing the presence of God and all of its fullness daily, and yet still find yourself filled with violence within. Because when you lift your heart toward your will instead of God's will, you leave the dance floor and you get your own. It says this, you defiled your sanctuaries by the multitude of your iniquities, by the iniquity of your trading. There's this trade that keeps going on in this narrative. Is you had this, but you traded it for this. Therefore, I brought fire from your midst. My observation is this, is we exist in a place, but we live in a culture. It means I can exist somewhere in South Africa. I've been to Johannesburg, Cape Town. I can go anywhere in the world. And I can exist in a place, but as soon as I open my mouth, they're going to go, where are you from? Because what's in me will come out. And see, we exist in a place, but we live in a culture because a culture lives in us. And so we can be in the midst of a hell existence, but bring heaven in because we have a heaven culture. Or we can be in the midst of heaven and yet live in hell because there is something broken in the inside of us where we cannot submit to God's ultimate will for our life. And that violence isn't about fighting. That violence is saying, I'm filled with inner turmoil because I do not know who I am. So why does God hate greed and love generosity? Well, the narrative of Lucifer's fall goes through into the book of Isaiah. It says this, how you were fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning, how you were cut down to the ground, you who weakened the nations, for you have said in your heart. Remember it said iniquity was found in you? You have said in your heart, I will ascend into heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will also sit on the mount of the congregation on the farthest sides of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will be like the Most High. In this particular part of the story, what you see is 5 I wills. In Jeremiah 31, verses 33 to about 34, 35, you will see that when Jeremiah is prophesying into the new covenant, there are God's 5 I wills that replace these ones. That as part of the new covenant, there is a new covenant, God's I will, that keep us safe from these I wills. But why does God love generosity and hate greed? Why would Jesus let so many things off and get them saved and let them go through and just say, sin no more, I've got you, don't worry about it? And yet when it came to people who said, I'll just build bigger barns, he was like, oh, I don't like this. Because there was something in greed that when it's manifested on earth is actually, and if I can say it this way, a Luciferian spirit. That it's actually saying, I'm going to leave God's dance floor and I'm going to hoard and be greedy on my own. I don't want to be part of God's story for the world. I want to be part of my own. But when I'd see this, it used to stir me because I'd be like, what is he even saying? Because the story goes, as much as I was told when I was young, was that Lucifer decided to start a coup in heaven. God had no idea about it. Right? Like, oh, he had no idea. He startled him. God has an anger issue. He said, now I'm so mad that you fooled me, I'm going to send you to hell. Right? Takes 1/3 of the angels with him. Hunky-dory, he's now Satan, and he's the enemy of our souls. That's the story. I'm a 3rd-generation Christian kid, and I grew up with these stories. But I always found a discomfort in the fact that God didn't know about it. There's something off with that story. Because if God is all-powerful, all-knowing, and everywhere, it means he knew. Very often we would look at opposites, and if I were to just throw it out there, people would say the opposite of hot is cold, the opposite of black is white, the opposite of day is night. And then you'd say, what's the opposite of Jesus? And they'd go, the devil. Really? The opposite of God is the devil? Since when? At which point did the Creator have an opposition with the created being? Who cannot be everywhere at once, who is not all-powerful, and is not who is all-knowing. We have to take out of the narrative of our belief system that the enemy is the opposite to God. God is not in opposition to anybody. There is no one that can stand up and have a fight with him and say, I had a good crack at that. But what if this war in the heavens was about God's ecosystem and the dance versus an ecosystem and a solo dance floor? Because what if it was about God's will and a selfish will going to war? Because this is what, if you break down the words, what you find his request is. I will also bind myself and make covenant with on the mount of the congregation on the farthest or extreme parts of recesses, sides of the north, which is a place of hidden darkness, a place of hoarding, treasure, and glory. Which really, he says, I want to bind myself to extreme recesses of darkness to hoard treasure and glory for himself. Wow. So Lucifer goes to God and he says his 5 I wills, and right at the end he says, and I want to bind myself to the extreme recesses of darkness to hoard glory and treasure for myself. And then God says, your will be done. You want it? You can have it. There's no opposite to God. He's gave him what he wanted. The problem is that when you live in an ecosystem, you become so addicted to yourself and your own will that you lose sense of reality around you. He had the glory of God every day, every second of that day, every moment of his being. And yet, he said, I want it for myself. Jonathan Edwards, the 18th century theologian, says this way, Lucifer thought himself too good to minister to us the glory and riches of heaven. Notice he says riches of heaven too. To the chief angel we were nothing, and he despised the fact that God would love us. Lucifer would have ministered to us, however, his mindset was one of, why would I minister to such feeble, mean, and despicable creatures, so inferior to himself or so inferior to his perfection and beauty? He would never subject himself to such inferior creatures, thus occasioned his fall. What he was saying was, I refuse to be a conduit of God's glory to the people God wants me to minister to. And this is why he would take his fight to us on a whole other level. The very thing that he fought to have, I want you to see this, he was just a glorified employee. The reason he hated humanity so much is because God would form us in his image. He would clothe us in the glory and give us access. The glory is our inheritance. The presence of God is our inheritance. That he designed us for the very thing that Lucifer would covet, and he never got to have nor hold. It just went through him. You wonder why he's the enemy of us, because the very thing God gave us for free, he couldn't even work to get. That's the power of being a son and a daughter. Not a slave or an employee. But he considered us too weak and despicable, yet God never did. He said, I'll get my hands dirty, I'll make them a glorified mud pie, and then I'd breathe my spirit into them and clothe them in the very thing that one chief angel coveted for so long. And so why does God hate greed so much? Simple. Because his chief angel tried to be greedy with the very thing he was meant to be generous with. And he went from the dance of God to his own dance floor in a dark recess, hoarding glory and treasure for himself. My observation is this: in God's kingdom culture, nothing diminishes when you are generous. Actually, you keep receiving the fullness of the kingdom of heaven. The fixed pie syndrome is a lie. In God's kingdom, he owns the pie shop. Lucifer says, I won't minister to them, I won't give them anything. Jesus says, I'm willing to die for them and give them everything. Jesus said, God, your will be done. In that garden, he said, Father, your will be done. And yet in the heavens, the millennia before that, God said to Lucifer, well, your will be done. What kind of people do we want to be on planet Earth? The kind that say to God, your will be done? Or the kind that God says, I love you, but if you really want that, your will be done. In Luke 16, 19 and 24, there's a parable about the rich man and Lazarus. And the story goes that there is a rich man and there is a beggar called Lazarus at his gate. A rich man clothed in purple robes. Jesus intentionally says that because he was telling the story to a whole bunch of rich men in purple clothes. And this is the only parable where someone is named. He says this, he says, the rich man dies and goes to hell. Lazarus dies, who's a beggar outside of his gates, and goes into what they call the bosom of Abraham, which was simply, it was paradise, or our words of heaven. And the story goes like this. Lazarus is there in heaven enjoying the company of Abraham. And this rich man, and isn't it funny that the person who thought he had identity and all the riches that claimed his identity in God's eyes, in Jesus' story, has no name. It's like if you overlook the poor man outside of your gate, you don't even have an identity in the kingdom. Like, what's your name? And yet, the poor man that had no identity here on earth, no influence, no title, in the kingdom, he had a name. And so, this rich man turns to Lazarus. And he says, "Hey, Lazarus." And what's funny is Abraham calls this rich man son. He says, because he was obviously a person of faith, he just wasn't generous. So he says this, and he wasn't generous to the poor man outside the gate. So he says this, he was religious, but he didn't have that relationship. And so this rich man turns to Lazarus and he says, "Hey, Lazarus, can you come down here and just put some water on my tongue? Because it must have been hot." He says, "Would you just come down from heaven and just drip some water on my tongue to relieve me?" Isn't it interesting that he's still trying to boss the poor man around? That he thinks that even though they're in two very different places, that he still has the right to boss someone around, to see them as less than themselves. And why? Is because he left the dance. He left God's ecosystem and walked into his ecosystem. So much so that in eternity, his ego never changed. He says, "Come on, just give me a little bit, just a little bit of water on my tongue to relieve the pain." But see, living in hell is when you become so addicted to yourself that you cannot determine reality anymore. He was still egotistical. He hadn't changed. He hadn't thought to himself, "Hey, you know what? I was really mean to you and you're over there. Maybe I should have a conversation about what this looks like." But nope. But here's some observations. Is the rich man never asked to get out of hell. He's content as long as he has some refreshment. He never says, "Can you get me out?" There's not one point in that story where he says, "Can somebody get me out of here?" He says, "Actually, I'm okay here. Just can you come and give me some refreshment while I'm here?" It's almost like if you lived in a reality that was hellish outside of church or outside of a faith community, and every week you would come in like this, just a little. I just need a little bit of refreshment. I live in hell and I'm addicted to my own ego. But you know what? Every week I come in, the worship's amazing, and I just need a little bit of refreshment. Rather than saying, "God, I don't want this life anymore. I want to step into the dance floor of God. I want the dance. I want your will." But it's in the human condition, and I'm guilty of it, saying, "God, I want my stuff, but if I get just a touch of heaven every now and then, I'll think I'm all right." Just a little bit of worship, just one podcast, and it refreshes me enough to numb the pain in the reality I'm living in. But what if God has so much more for you? And he wants to set you free from the reality that if you're living in something like that, it's time to get out. Don't ask for some refreshment. Ask for the floodwaters. To say, "God, I don't want my own dance floor. I don't want my ecosystem. I don't want my will. I want your will, your dance floor, and your ecosystem." The rich man never asked to get out of hell. He tries to get Lazarus in. Have you ever thought to yourself, when you are living in your own ecosystem, and sometimes every now and then you get lonely and someone's having a good life over there, you try to guilt them into coming over here? It's like, "Hey, you should come hang out with me over here." And then usually it's an environment filled with negativity, gossip, stinginess. Because it's all about just feeding ourselves, hoarding glory for ourselves, rather than trying to be a conduit to the rest of the world. And this is a challenge we face in the world of social media, is we have a face, a reality, a photo that makes it all about us. And I love social media for the benefits. But we have to be careful that we don't become egotistical maniacs living on our own dance floor whilst taking selfies constantly. They're called selfies for a reason. Even the name is bad. he tries to get Lazarus in. Have you ever been or had a friend that would never change their life, but they always tried to bring you down to their level, drag you into their reality, whilst refusing to ever coming into yours? And finally, the rich man blames God. This is God's fault. Most addicts blame somebody else. We have a choice on a daily basis, just like Jesus did, because the mandate's to be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. We have fruitfulness. If we want to multiply the kingdom of heaven into the world, we have to choose, God, are you allowed to break us to multiply us? I'm okay with you multiplying me, but I'm willing to go through the process to see it happen. C.S. Lewis said this: the doors of hell are locked from the inside. A daily choice, a daily reality that we get to think, God, is it your will today or is it my will today? In 2 Kings 5, there's a story of Elisha, Gehazi, and a general called Naaman. And Naaman has leprosy. He has leprosy, he's sick, and he hears from one of his servant girls that there is a prophet called Elisha that can heal him. And so he takes a whole bunch of riches with him. If we were to look at the figure that he would have carried with him, it would have been in the millions, because when a general traveled, they had to carry enough money to get through anything they needed to get through, to pay for things, but also to make deals with other nations and other armies, etc. So he would have had millions with him, traveling with him, the gold and the talents and the silver and the diamonds, all that. He would have had millions with him. And so he comes to Elisha, and Elisha doesn't even leave his house to meet him. He won't even come out. He just says, Gehazi, just go tell him to... Now, this is the general of the army that is oppressing and ruling that region. And he's like, you know what, Gehazi, I'm not interested in meeting this person. Just tell him that God will heal him, but he needs to go to this particular river. Now, that particular place that he went to was not some fancy river. It was pretty much like a yucky, weird mud pit. And Naaman would have thought to himself, I am a general. I am not doing that. But he had to choose leprosy or humility. That's one God's dance floor. Or leprosy. And so he eventually goes. He gets healed. And he comes back and he says, Elisha, what can I pay you for that? Elisha says, nothing. He says, I don't want anything. You see, because when I got instructed, I had to be generous with the kingdom of heaven to you. It cost me nothing. You can have it. I was following the instruction of God. Go get healed. It's free. It's priceless, but it's free. So, take it freely. He continues to say, no, but surely I have to pay you something. There's a difference between paying for a miracle and sowing into the kingdom. There's a difference. What he was trying to do, because he had what you'd consider a world mentality, is I pay for what I get. So he's leaving. So Naaman leaves and says, all right, if you don't want my money, and he's carrying millions, remember? He said, if you don't want it, fine, I'll take it back. So Elisha could have added a new story to his house. Bought a new donkey. They were real flash back then. And he doesn't. Because in him, the kingdom of heaven was about an ecosystem. And if he was obedient to the will of God, which was, Father, your will be done, then I'm going to give this man the instruction to get himself healed. For nothing. Gehazi decides, oh, this dude's loaded. This dude's loaded. And so he runs back to Naaman as Naaman is leaving, and he said, my master has changed his mind. And he says, he wants some money. So Naaman, being ignorant to the fact, because Gehazi was Elisha's spokesperson, said, here, take a whole bunch of money. And in that moment, it says this, that leprosy that was on Naaman came upon Gehazi. And here's why. Gehazi was lined up to be Elisha's successor. Elijah passed his mantle on to Elisha. Elisha was going to pass his mantle on to Gehazi. Yet, somewhere in Gehazi's mentality, he left the dance floor of God and he said, "My will be done." And right in the beginning, we looked at the trade that Lucifer played with. The trade, the iniquity that was found in him. Gehazi was in the midst of one of the greatest prophets that ever walked the planet. Elisha was so powerful that when he'd been laid to rest, his bones were in a tomb. They put a dead man in the tomb. That dead man touched his bones and resurrected back to life. This is that guy. He was in the midst of the presence of God, a man of God, being mentored by a prophet like Elisha, and yet somewhere in there, he was existing in a place, but his culture wasn't in him. And he traded his future succession plan for a quick buck. For a, let me hoard this treasure for myself. And God said, well, your will be done. C.S. Lewis says, if I could have the musicians up, please. C.S. Lewis says this. There's only two kinds of people. Two kinds of people. The first kind of person who is on the God dance floor and says to God, your will be done. And the second kind of person who wants their own dance floor, God says, well, your will be done. The kingdom of heaven is constantly moving. It's constantly a moving, redemptive narrative to the whole world. Constantly. It's moving. It's alive. The presence of God, the glory of God. It's alive. His love is alive for you, for me. Even when the children of Israel, and I'll close with this story, when the children of Israel were given the promised land, they were given blocks of land. And in order for them to thrive, God refused to let a slave mentality come into the promised land. He did not let the generation that whinged and complained and fantasized about Egypt into the promised land. Here's why. You cannot take a slave mentality into a promise of God. You cannot justify broken as your normal if you want to live in the fullness of what God has for you. So he just refused to let him in. And so when he gets the right people into the promised land, the generation that was sons and daughters and not slaves, he says to them this: on your block of land, when you harvest and leave the corners free to give away. How does God break a mentality of slavery? It's not through a prayer line. It's through generosity. Now, if I could encourage you this, I believe so much in the future of Emerge. I believe in the significance of its call and its prophetic and apostolic mandate. That God is asking all of us to say, let's live bigger and give bigger. Let's be the most generous group of people on the planet. Let's not find our own dance floor, but actually step onto God's. He would say to this group of people, give away the corners and live on the circle. Why is that? Because how you break a slave mentality is this. Don't live right to the margin so you have nothing to give. I'm not a mathematician, but I did do the math. That it's about 78 to 79% was theirs. The rest they gave away. Because you can't give freely if you're living on your block of land and on somebody else's called MasterCard. Or some, you know what I'm saying? You can't live on 105% and then want to freely give. God's saying, be a good steward. Live with margin. And it'll break the poverty, slave mentality, if you have one. Because you're giving away something and saying, God, there's even more I can give. Let's not hoard. Let's not live in that fear. Because what I said this morning was this. Is slaves hoard because they fear the future. But sons and daughters give freely because they know who holds the future.